officially a member in Australia. I am a member of Australia. I was the architect of the Cathedral, and I am introducing Monsieur Thomas Hegg, who is a celebrated author, and he will read to you several stories about Archbishop Ireland. Monsieur Hegg.
He's my cousin, he had to do it. I was asked by the Cathedral if I would be interested in writing a story about John Ireland, and apart from legend, I really didn't know too terribly much about him. So I went back into his history, and I'm a teacher of about 32 years experience at Breck School over in Golden Valley, and the part of John Ireland's story that caught my imagination the most was his education. It's quite a tale. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'll have time for a couple of little questions, and then I have a second story that I'm going to be debuting, a new book that I'm going to be debuting today, which is called Bring It, a book especially written for high school graduates. But here is a little bit of John Ireland's childhood and his education and how it came to pass in a work of historical fiction. The power of the April sun could at long last be felt again. The Minnesota winter had been as stubborn and obstreperous as any child, bent on having its own way. It had even seemed at times as if this most unreasonable of the New World seasons might well choose never to end. Exhilarated by the feeling on the back of their necks that the weather might be turning in their favor, John and his younger friend, Tom O'Gorman, stripped off their woolen jackets, and with two newly revealed sledgehammers, they started pounding away on the thick, massive sheath of ice covering the long walkway leading up to the Ireland's front porch. As with most prosaic activities begun by robust boys, this one quickly turned into a sport, complete with rules, points, penalties, bylaws, all invented and agreed to on the fly. John went at it with the same jolly fury and wide-eyed intensity that Tom aspired to match one day, especially on the football pitch. Exploding, chunks and chips of ice flew, and honeyed solar rays went to work on them. "Oh, Tom," said John, "this is nothing. We'll have done it in no time at all." And during the third quarter, or was it the second period, when the boys were scarlet-cheeked and sweating freely as the icicles hanging off the dormers, Mrs. Ireland at last got their attention after several increasingly loud attempts. Bishop Cretin wanted to see them at the cathedral, and now their first thought, "Dear Lord, what have we done?" They were going to France. It didn't seem real, more like a dream. John and Tom were thoroughly thrilled. All was excitement and congratulation, tempered by some schoolyard jealousy that was, in its turn, duly processed and expiated by the judicious application of fists. The day that His Grace had called them to the cathedral, Tom and John had never felt more gobsmacked or confused, all out of breath before the serene round prelate, convinced that they were in the deepest of trouble, completely unable to remember doing so dark a deed as might have prompted an emergency meeting with the highest ranking divine of the diocese, and in sweaty work clothes that neither of them would ever think of wearing to Mass, they stood awaiting his dread judgment. The good bishop asked the boys to kneel before the statue of the Blessed Virgin and to place their hands upon the altar. Taking an actorly tone worthy of the Comédie Française, Joseph Cretin raised his hands above them and said, "I put you under the protection of God and His Blessed Mother. You are the beginning of my diocesan seminary, the first seminarians of St. Paul." John and Tom were thunderstruck. Now, what the hell was that all about? Well, they would learn, and quickly. Their bishop deemed them fit candidates for holy orders. Dear sweet Mother of God, why them? Well, they were only another pair of dirty little Irish boys. or so said their teacher, and the great chorus of toffs backing him up, and therefore unfit for any future that didn't involve a pickaxe, a shovel, a broom, and the bottle. For the rest of that day and long into the night, sitting before the fire in the Ireland home, the boys stared at one another in open-mouthed silence. This was an unprecedented situation. John Ireland, who always had plenty to say about everything, was actually at a loss for words, and Tom O'Gorman would never let him forget it. Le petit séminaire de Meximieux had to the boys the look of eternity about it. At 14 and 11, respectively, John and Tom were already older than most of the comparatively crude buildings they had left behind in St. Paul. And the boys didn't yet have the eyes to see that the seminary was really a sort of architectural crazy quilt, a polyglot of styles, the result of additions made from various eras, each one self-satisfied, independent, and almost scornful of the others. A wag once observed that in this Meximieux is nothing other than La Belle France herself, in small. John and Tom, standing in the refectory for the first time, bags in hand, gawped at by young seminarians who couldn't wait to get a glimpse of the two wild young frontiersmen come to join them, felt ten-thumbed, left-footed, and cowlicked. In a few minutes, Father Raveau would leave, and then they would be at the mercy of this grand, strange-looking place, and all the grand, strange-looking strangers in it. Vicar General Augustin Raveau had chaperoned the boys all the way from St. Paul. After a month of having his shoelaces knotted together, his tumbler filled with salt water, his cassock run up the flagpole, and his books glued together, he could scarcely conceal his delight at the prospect of being rid of the pair of them. During that entire voyage, he had only been certain of the boys' whereabouts while hearing their confessions. This, of course, meant reliving and forgiving the whole catalogue of pranks and practical jokes played at his expense. The paperwork completed, Father Raveau turned to the boys and magnanimously extended his hand in a gesture of parting. But Tom was trembling, white as a sheet, and he had tears rolling down both cheeks. "Please, Father," he said, I want to go home." Stunned, Raveau turned to the superior, Father Tarlet. Oh, this was not the first time the much older man had seen this kind of phenomenon. Instead of intervening, though, he just looked calmly in the direction of the older boy. Although John had been able thus far to check his own tears and maintain an outward semblance of equilibrium, the hidden truth was that he felt much the same as Tom did. All that misbehavior aboard ship had only been attempts to distract themselves from the fear and anxiety that had begun to set in. Bishop Cretin had said to the Irelands and the O'Gormans in the presence of the boys that they would never be under any obligation to stay, and that they could discontinue their studies at any time without financial penalty befalling either family. Maybe it would be better to turn around just now, while they still had Father Raveau to see them home. Oh, this had been a very generous offer and all, but perhaps the bishop was wrong, and the boys weren't cut out to be priests. Father Raveau might well agree. John stole a quick glance down the hall and was surprised to see that the curiosity seekers had vanished. Tom's tears had provoked no derisive laughter from them, no harsh ridicule, why there was no audience at all for the unfolding of this private, intimate, but momentous drama. Father Raveau, well out of his emotional element, but trying nonetheless to be of some kind of help, frisked himself again and again in search of an elusive handkerchief. Father Tarley continued to look toward John with an expression of the deepest understanding and the warmest compassion. John wasn't really sure what he had been expecting, but this was no forbidding martinet with a black vendetta in his heart. This was a true priest. Without a word having been spoken, a flood of sweet relief suddenly washed over him, and John began to see that whatever else may await in store for him here, there was no harm, and he was welcome. The panic that had been welling up inside of him abated, and it was replaced by a glorious, confident, sunlit sense of well-being. For the first time in his life, it occurred to John Ireland that his presence in a circle of people other than his own wasn't going to be merely tolerated. He was welcome. He was as welcome here as anyone else who had ever walked these posh halls, and so was Tom. No shameful notions of being only dirty little Irish boys, and therefore unworthy, were going to stop them. Not now, not anymore, not ever. John placed his big son of a carpenter hands on Tom's shoulders. Looking at him square in the eye, John said, "Oh, Tom, this is nothing. We'll have done it in no time at all." Tom, who had been quite persuaded until that moment that he would never be happy again, dissolved into 11-year-old boy giggles. The ice had been broken, and so had the pernicious low-grade fever had broken. That has a way of spiking for those of us who carry it. At precisely those moments of golden opportunity, forks in the road, and when things have been going perhaps a bit too well for a while. Oh, John and Tom would make many mistakes in the future for which they would have to atone, but never again would they make apology for who and whose they were. Their first challenge was now behind them, their first and most important lesson learned, and the boys picked up their gear in preparation for being shown to their quarters. A thought popped into John's head, and he reached into his pocket and produced a folded white handkerchief. He then said, "I believe this is yours, Father," and handed it to Augustin Graboux. Sometime later, while in a mad fit of sneezing, the Vicar General would come to know that his hanky had been infused with rather a lot of pepper. John Ireland went from strength to strength, spurred on by the success of winning distinctions and honors, and as much as he admired the intellectual rigor and the academic integrity of the extraordinary institution in which he had truly found himself, John Ireland prized even more the relations formed with the men who had been his teachers over the 4 years he spent at Meximieux, and for the rest of his life, they would be sources of comfort and fresh inspiration. And this is how he described them in 1891, 35 years after his matriculation. Tarley, the ideal superior, great in his dignity and his sacerdotal gravity, edifying in his piety, tender in his affection for his pupils, how we hated to displease him. Robelin, the saint and the father. Banoufin, a learned and profound man. Moffat, the distinguished litterateur, able to inspire a taste for what was good and a love of serious studies. Pasquier, the untiring workman, a living encyclopedia with an answer for every question. Perrier, precise, clear, sparkling in mind, eloquent of speech, with ideas new and original. Had they been called to higher spheres, to more eminent posts, they would have become historical personages, as did Archbishop John Ireland, their most distinguished and accomplished graduate, advisor to presidents, founder of schools, giant of the Vatican, international diplomat, author and speaker, and the man who raised the very walls of this magnificent cathedral.